spanning the globe. From Sunday talk shows to his Twitter feed, from across the fruited plains to Mars, bitches, it's Sam Seder and bullshit. And now, Sam Seder.
I really think that the 2000 election.
Oh, that's the first one I have.
Well, I think the 2000 election and 9/11, which I imagine is your second one, are, but particularly the 2000 election, I felt was a big turning point for me in the way that I saw. In the way that I saw the structure of our society. I mean, prior to that, I think, I certainly, I remember, thinking Ronald Reagan was horrible and being told by my professors and entering college in 1984 that there had been a realignment. And I remember, Bill Clinton coming in and sort of everyone being super excited. And I remember thinking, like, I can understand why you're relieved, but super excited about this. Like, everything seemed to be more like, okay, it's a tennis match on some level, right. As opposed to like, wait a second, it's a tennis match, but they're not, they don't have any line, like they don't seem to hit any of the balls. They don't call the balls when they go outside the lines, and their rackets are much bigger. I don't know why I'm using tennis, but it goes back and forth. I mean, so, and I felt like that started around 2000.
Yeah, and that's just, putting aside the fact that, to extend the metaphor, the tennis match is a limited number of participants, right, who are able to meaningfully affect politics in the United States, right? You need to have a certain level of wealth probably and political influence to do that. We're a hierarchical society, and yet even on its own terms, they weren't playing by the rules in almost like comical fashion. And so starting with the 2000 election, I'm not going to go through the ins and outs of the entire run up to the election and then more importantly, the counting of the votes afterwards. It's very well trod territory, but broad strokes for people who maybe aren't familiar, to make things as short and as simple as the truth will allow. Returns in Florida in the 2000 presidential election were very close between Bush and Gore, and there were multiple issues with precincts not undertaking legally required recounts that Gore never challenged in state court. Fights about the deadline for Florida to certify its electoral votes, who got to decide when that was, and thus determine who was going to be president. Lots of judges, lawyers, words flying to and fro, chock full of legal opinions, both dubious and not. But at the end of it all, the most important thing really, and the only thing to note, is that it was really voted by 9 people on a bare majority of 5-4. This became the true tally for the 2000 election. And, I still live in a very conservative area, Sam. This is R plus 15 congressional districts. It's one of the most conservative in the country. There's a huge military base right next to me. So the town's main economic engine is the military-industrial complex. And yet, even I could see plain on the face of some of the adults in my life that they were freaked the fuck out, to put it plain. They had no idea what had just happened. I don't.
Well, let me back up just a little bit on that too. Okay, so just a little more context. The Secretary of State, Catherine Harris, in Florida, was also the co-chair of the George W. Bush campaign. The other co-chair was the governor of Florida, Jeb Bush.
Please clap.
And they had disenfranchised a lot of Florida voters. They had a whole campaign set up to do that. There was also in West Palm Beach the butterfly ballot, which confused a lot of people and had a lot of elderly Jewish people voting for Pat Buchanan instead of Al Gore and Joe Lieberman. Highly unlikely choice that they would have made. particularly Pat Buchanan, not considered a friend of the Jews, as it were. One of the other attributes of that campaign that goes in, and it's sort of like, there's always a number of reasons. Al Gore did not run on Bill Clinton's economy. He did not basically have Bill Clinton, who was an extremely popular candidate at that time, campaign for him because it was still in the shadow of the impeachment that did not remove him from office, but made him a moral scourge amongst a significant population. That's why Joe Lieberman was on that ticket, because he was the most prominent Democrat in the Senate to come out and tisk Bill Clinton on the whole thing. And so that's just the setup. And, I was at that point maybe 6-7 years out of having done 1 year of law school. I came from a family of lawyers. I read, I was more interested in reading about, lawyers and stuff like that. And the legal profession, it always felt to me, was in a state of shock when the Supreme Court took that case and then ruled the way they did. Like, they didn't think the Supreme Court would take the case because the Florida State Supreme Court had addressed it. I've said many times, I think people probably know this, there is no federal right to vote. These elections are run by the state.
Right. And I'm not a lawyer, but I believe it's pretty unusual for a United States federal court of any kind to rule on a state constitution on its own terms. They might evaluate whether or not it conflicts with the federal constitution in some way or something else, but they don't usually just tell the state of Florida what its jurisprudence is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty rare. I mean, it's not, in this instance, they weren't really addressing a state law, but, it was unique that they took the case. And of course, if people read Bush v. Gore as, in terms of the ruling, it was they say in there, I can't remember the exact terms, but like, this only applies for this case.
Yeah, it's a one-off. You can't use this ever.
It's a one-off. And yeah, we're going to do one of those. And of course, it didn't end up. I think people have relied in some respects on it, not to the best of results. And so there was a real state of shock. And in fact, I interviewed somebody about this, or it came up recently on one of the interviews we did for Vacation. And I remembered in Newsweek was going to come out with an article, and it had come out, but it didn't reach the cover, about a fracture on the Supreme Court that sort of broke out into the open with a meeting, ironically enough, with Russian judges over the summer in 2000 over that ruling. And it was shocking because the recount, I mean, I personally, I was super obsessed with it. I had taken, this was before, digital photos or phones that had cameras on it.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
And it was, the VCR was actually, relatively, I don't know. We were still VCRs, and right. You could tape stuff. People would tape stuff, but I spent hours in front of the TV watching all of it, taking pictures of my television, because I just that was
that was what you had to do that was all there was. Which I have more on that later because the tech environment was a lot different. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it was very weird, and people should also know that there was no like left voices in the media.
Exactly.
I mean, you
even
could
less
listen
than
to,
now. Even less than now. Like it may seem like today with nothing, but
I mean, no. I like none.
Yeah.
Not less. None. There was zero. And I cannot tell you, there is a complete ecosystem. I'm not talking, because there was no social media, there was no YouTube, there was no podcasts, there was none on the radio. Maybe if you listen to like a Pacifica station that you could get that would have, like rarely, but there was no, and even almost like, there was no liberal voices. You know,
No,
that's what we.
there was really nothing.
There was nothing.
Facebook doesn't even start until 2004. YouTube the next year. Twitter sometime in the late, I think 06 or 07.
Those platforms that you're talking about were in any way delivering political news.
No,
None
especially not at first. And even the first like real smartphone to take off the United States doesn't come out till 2007, right?
Yeah, there's nothing. There was nothing. Keith Olbermann didn't become Keith Olbermann until 2005. The closest thing to that will be Air America in 2004. Maybe here in a locality there, you can find a local talk radio host who, in between some conservative broadcasts is espousing something to the left. But there was nothing. There was no dissent as to what was going on. When people protested George W. Bush, the inauguration, they were hidden behind the bleachers. And so you could not see that on TV. You were not aware of it. I didn't know about it until maybe a year later.
Right.
And I can tell you that my sense of that was so palpable at the time. I was an actor and a director that I wrote a movie based upon a comedic character I was doing prior to the election, which just ironically enough was Joe Lieberman's son from West Palm Beach. It was a total coincidence. And a fictional character, obviously. And I wrote a movie that was really about the frustration I felt about the muting of dissent in the wake of that election. And it pushed this guy to end up committing a terrorist attack that was a lot less funny by the time we got to editing it later that year for obvious reasons. But that's what that no blogs, nothing. It just felt so isolating.
And there was only a few months between the inauguration and the terrorist attacks of 2001. We never really shook it off, from what I recall. It didn't seem to me.
Like I say, my understanding was that Newsweek was going to run a cover piece. They ran the piece, but on September 13th, that was going to talk about the split in the Supreme Court, and it took that long for people to sort of regain their footing. I think after that, George W. Bush was not a popular president in those first 6 months, 8 months, 9 months of his administration. And, but there was no dissent. There was no avenues for dissent. There was no blogs. There was nothing.
Yeah, it was impossible for anyone to even throw peanuts in the way that we kind of can today. These claims about, that most people are probably familiar with at this point, about Iraq possessing chemical, biological, maybe even nuclear weapons. This was really, in some ways, our first postmodern war, definitely the Pentagon's first modern media rollout, sort of in the new era that we created for ourselves, at a kind of weird time where some of the tech for this mass communication was there, but it was even less democratized than it is today, and it made it really, really easy to spin yarns. And the people not you, but a good-hearted liberal will say, might rely upon to push back against that kind of thing, like Tim Russert perhaps, or that didn't amount to anything at all.
I mean, Tim Russert was not that guy. The liberals, people who identified as liberals by 2003, and people to identify as a liberal at that point was as far left as anybody would identify. I mean, there's a clip of Bernie Sanders being, getting to an argument with Duke Cunningham on the floor from 1993 or something, and Duke Cunningham, he's not calling him a socialist, even though that's how Bernie Sanders would self-identify. He's calling him a liberal because that was the bad word. So there was a lot of us who were just I'm going to call myself a liberal as a way of saying F you.
I did.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. The idea that you would have to admit it now just shows like how far we have come. Because at that time, I mean, I was on the radio in 2004 and I had people calling. I mean, it was a liberal talk radio is the way that we pitched it. And I had people calling going like, you just admitted you're a liberal on radio. And
Gotcha.
I'm like, yeah, it's a liberal talk radio network. And that would blow people's minds. But let's go to 2000. Let's go to 9/11 because that is when I think like things got bad, super bad.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of 9/11, the only other thing that I have that I really remember that was like visceral, and a lot of these incidents, they're not. What I'm talking about is not necessarily the most historically impactful stuff, but I really do think that we sometimes give short shrift to the idea that humans are creatures of biology, and the modern media environment that we're living in now has not at all been the norm for our evolutionary history. It can do weird things to our brains that we haven't seen before. It can affect us in ways that they don't usually. And so in that sense, like, not everything under the sun is old, right? In 2004, things are a little different though, right? War fevers kind of begin to wane. Major combat operations in Iraq are over. The president's famously declared mission accomplished. U.S. troops continue to take casualties, but support for the war finally dropped to around 39%. And around that time, the 9/11 Commission's hearings also began happening. And I think a lot of the beginnings of the sort of incompetence that people recognize with the W administration started to seep into our discourse, and it seemed like that November the tide might turn, that we might not keep doing this obviously brutal and stupid shit that we had been doing.
Yeah, well, let me just say one more thing about the wake of 9/11. A couple of things. That you had situations where you started to hear talk of like, you should be careful how you speak. That's what got Bill Maher fired from ABC television. You had Ari Fleischer basically telling people, you got to be careful how you speak at this time. There were protests where you had record burnings, literally burnings of Dixie Chick records.
I remember the
because
Dixie
they
Chicks.
had said something in Germany, like, sorry about George Bush at that time. And there was just this overall sense of like of propaganda. Coincidentally, in maybe 2000, late 2001 or 2000, maybe 2002. I can't remember now when it was, but I went to Cuba with my then wife. She was making a documentary there, and I saw striking similarities to the sort of propaganda you would see. I remember going in, to Nebraska, to Lincoln, Nebraska, to see a buddy of mine, and riding in a car. He picked me up and driving from I can't remember what airport it was, not the Lincoln one. A billboard about the firefighters, running into the burning building. And it being jingoistic in an attempt to sort of drive an angry patriotism, as it were. And it was a very strange time. And by 2004, there was a sense, you're right, that that people were starting to see through Bush. And, we had seen stuff like a guy like Max Cleland, I think in 2002, lose his election.
From my neck of the woods, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the guy who lost both his legs, and both, and maybe one of his arms. I can't remember.
Both his legs and one of his arms. Yeah.
And he was there was an ad against him, and I can't remember who it was that ran it. Maybe the sitting, and I don't think the sitting governor, but morphing him into Osama bin Laden.
Right. Yeah, I remember that. It was amazing.
That was and you think Democrats are weak in this context. They were extremely weak in that context. And
I would say that's the only two places you might go on like big television networks, no joke, that might give you a different perspective were like Saturday Night Live and The Daily Show. And that was it.
I mean, The Daily Show, not as much as you would think. That by the time Jon Stewart got onto The Daily Show, which I think was like maybe 2002, I'm not sure. He didn't start the show. There was a couple of years where it was, it was still very much a media critique show. It would not get into politics. I mean, he did so a little bit more later, but not so much. It was always more of a media critique show. And in like 2004, early 2004, I think it was, or maybe late 2003, Jon Stewart went on there on CNN and with Tucker Carlson and Paul Begala.
Yeah, and famously demolished them.
Well, particularly Tucker. And he said, "You're hurting America." And he said it to both of them, but it was really, but it was less about the politics and more about the rancor. And
the failure of the media. That was like a phrase you heard endlessly, I'd say, around that time.
But the funny thing is that dovetailed with the critique of people who were dissenting from what was going on. And so it was pushed and embraced, even though it wasn't a political critique. It was more a structural critique about dissent and about, we want good news. You know what I mean? And so that's when blogs started to get very big in like 2002, really following 9/11 to a large extent, and the election. Blogs started getting very important. And it was the only time, or the first time, where you could actually like go and see a community online where people were articulating what you were feeling at that time if you were on the left. And a lot of differences were papered over because of the nature of the time on the left. But it was the start of something where there was like an organized critique.
But famously, it wasn't enough, and that was honestly throughout the whole decade as bad as things got in 2007, 2008. That was probably when a lot of us, myself included, felt at my lowest about politics. After that, I got two more. One you're very, very familiar with, I'm sure, called Hurricane Katrina. But the other was actually something called the Boxing Day Tsunami. People who don't know, this occurred on December 26, 2004 in the Indian Ocean. It's one of the worst natural disasters ever recorded in history. In terms of death toll, I think it's somewhere in the top 3 of all time, depending on how and what you count. The deadliest tsunami ever recorded, 250,000 people dead or gone missing. Millions more homeless, nearly possessionless, resources so overwhelmed that people could not both obtain their daily necessities and bury their dead. Uncle Sam contributed less than $1 billion to the whole thing. If my math is right, that's something like 0.0004% of the money we spent that year. And I do remember thinking at the time, that was a shame, and I was awful surprised. But you know what? Humans kind of tribal, nationalistic, right? It's kind of just obvious that they'd want to look out more for their own than they would other people from other nationalities. That's a shame. We don't agree with it, but something we're all familiar with. And then Katrina basically blows all that up because it turns out it doesn't matter. That their response to a disaster doesn't make a lick of difference whether or not it's big or small, whether or not it happens to them or in the Indian Ocean. They're actually just not capable of responding. And that was a pretty big deal, I think, at the time.
Yeah, Katrina was massive, and I would say it followed, if I remember correctly, the timeline. When Bush got reelected in 2004, the first thing he tried to do was privatize Social Security.
Corporate-backed Democrats who want to kill Social Security, and that's just bullshit.
And there was a real mobilization via the blogs to and Josh Marshall of all people basically created some type of like whip central to determine what Congress people were willing to come out and say that they weren't going to vote to privatize Social Security. And so Bush was weakened already. And what Katrina did is it opened the floodgate. People felt more comfortable critiquing him, I think, criticizing him across the board. And I think people just reacted in horror to seeing American citizens. People reacted in horror to seeing American citizens abandoned in that way. You know, like you got up close and personal views of it in a way that you wouldn't have with the tsunami. There was no language barrier, right? There was no, you had, I remember Shep Smith sitting on a bridge. And this is when Shep Smith became the Shep Smith that we see today, where O'Reilly was saying like, yeah, these guys, they're really not doing what they need to do to get out of there. And Shep Smith was like, no, you don't understand what's going on here. This is horrific. We have abandoned these people. It's wrong. I mean, it was pretty dramatic to see that. And one of the stories, too, that was quite clear early on. I mean, I remember being on air, and I think if I remember, it was clear that the hurricane was coming. I mean, over the weekend. And I think by Monday, it hit, and it was clear there was also a disaster going on. And the disaster was that they had botched FEMA, which was one of the few things that Clinton did really well, was build up FEMA. And and basically what happened was, by a Monday, I think it was. I mean, this is off the top of my head. I can't remember, but I think it was on Monday, because I was on Monday night. It was clear there was something had gone horribly, horribly wrong. And Bush ignored it for like 2 days. Like he went to somebody's, maybe it was John McCain's birthday party or something, and did, ignored it. And it was like, didn't even really focus on it at all. And it was just a slow moving, disaster that was getting ignored. It was very, very strange, but it was clear by Monday night. And it wasn't until like Wednesday or Thursday that Bush went there and, got and mobilized the military, whatever, to help people. It was the delay in the response that was, and then that snowballed into where people realized like there was a problem with FEMA. Everything had been subcontracted out. And, I specifically remember a story about all the buses that were supposedly going to be used to evacuate the city, because a lot of people didn't have cars, right? Didn't have money to leave New Orleans. And the buses that were going to be used to evacuate people, that it had been subcontracted out so many times because everything had been privatized, that the one of the primary bus companies, if I remember this correctly, basically had a decision: do we deploy our buses early enough so that they're there when they're needed? But if they're not needed, we're going to incur all this expense.
You lose money because it costs money.
You lose
to deploy
money.
them.
And I distinctly remember the issue being, profit is job number one for us, and it is not a profitable decision to get the buses there, a day early. But it was the only decision that could be made if you were going to have the kind of catastrophe that you have to avoid it. And they chose the profitable one. And that was, that was the horror show.
It was heartbreaking
to
watch happen in your own country. I know you don't have a ton of time left, so I just have a couple more things. In 2006, things actually do turn a little bit. Democrats don't just make modest gains; they absolutely dominate the midterms that year. They get a majority of state governorships. They have a majority in the House of Representatives. They have a 51-49 majority in the Senate, if you count Bernie Sanders and Joe Lieberman, which I'll let you, listener, decide if that's worth doing. And in 2008, we're starting to approach events more memorable to people, and things really actually seem to be turning around. And I forget where I heard you say this, but it was a day or so ago, I think. You reminded me that people literally were talking about the end of the Republican Party, right? Like they were going to fracture into this sort of Whig-like regional coalition that was never going to be able to compete with the Democratic brand ever again. It really was, as much as people like to make fun of it, hope and change. It did feel better. It really did, at least, especially compared to what we had all just been through, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was a little bit more skeptical than that, and I think at the time, frankly, I remember being worried that, like,
you were right to be, I think, but
well, I mean, my calculation was like Obama is like Clinton, but with a better chance of being a secret lefty, and when. And I mean, I think like I probably articulated it like that. Like, if I've got to bet who's going to turn out to be more left, I'm going to bet Obama. It still may not work out that way, but it's just a better bet. The odds are better. And, like when the whole Reverend Wright thing came out, I was like, oh, this makes it look like he's but he was not an ideologue. It was quite clear that he was not. His rhetoric turned a little bit populist at times. I'm going to walk, put on my walking shoes and go out there with unions, et cetera, et cetera. But, and, he turned out to be, what odds are he was going to be, a more or less a centrist.
I just think that even though in retrospect, a lot of this does appear clear to me, I also do think, myself included, a lot of people were just straight up traumatized by the previous 8 years. And when it gets capped off by that gigantic financial crisis that happens around the same time, it does sort of feel like maybe we're at the turn, or at least that's not crazy.
I definitely thought, that's different than saying that I definitely thought for sure that this could be very well the end of the Republican Party, because I saw, and I don't mean like literally, but I meant like they're going to be a regional party for years to come, because I saw Sarah Palin as basically a burning tire around the neck of the Republican Party, that Barack Obama would have an opportunity. He did. I think he squandered it to sort of like change people's attitudes for a generation. Had he done like double the amount for the stimulus, I think that they would have won. I think they would have picked up seats in 2010, frankly. And I think that there needed to be accountability for what had gone on during the Bush years. There was definitely an opportunity for the Republican Party to completely fall apart. And I also thought, okay, I mean, first of all, there was warranted excitement that a country whose politics had been dominated since day one in many respects by race.
Right.
And the things that were unique about American politics were racial questions. To have a black person as president, I thought, was going to, severely debilitate the ability of the Republican Party to use racism as an electoral cudgel. Now, I was really wrong about that. I mean, really wrong. I do think that the Republican Party was allowed to, to get up off the floor, frankly. I mean, I think there was a lot more that Obama could have done. And, it's conceivable that had he done those things, and matched the enthusiasm for him with really bold steps, that polarization that we saw would have basically made the Republican Party just go further, deeper down a wormhole and never to return. but I felt like they were given basically a ladder up, and they took it. So
Yeah, it does feel like that a lot. Almost as if they've knocked their opponent down and now they're extending a hand to get him back up, because getting the fight going again is really the point for them. It's the point is not to win. The point is to fight. I think a lot of times that's the problem with a lot of Democrats. It very suddenly in 2010, though, all this basically evaporates pretty drastically. There's a huge conservative backlash. The Democrats lose their majority, of course, and in the 2 years that they had unified control of the federal government, all quibbles about the Senate aside, which I really don't want to get into. Broadly speaking, nothing really got better for the average person. The cost of education, healthcare, and housing continued to skyrocket. Wages did not do that. We didn't actually leave our war on terror. We continue to fight it today. Union density declined, and all the while there's a foreclosure crisis, basically slow rolling through vast swaths of the nation. Among other things that I know about because you've had David Dayen on your show so many times.
Yeah. Jeff, give me 1 second. I just got to open the office door. I'll be right back.
Sure.
1 second.
A few moments later.
Sorry. All right. I got a little bit more time.
Almost
okay.
done. Yeah. If you remember what I said, go ahead.
Well, 2010 was worse than it should have been, I think. I mean, I think there's certain inevitability, but like I say, had Obama doubled the amount of the stimulus, I think he could have done that. I mean, they did that with TARP. The centrists put TARP on the floor a couple of times before it passed, took the stock market crashing to do so. He could have done the same. He could have done the same thing with the stimulus, frankly. Let the Republicans vote it down. Have a day or two where it looks like we're in economic disaster. They bring it back. It passes. That would have changed the calculus quite a bit. And I do think it's worth just noting the Democrats only had about 5 or 6 months, if that, of a filibuster-proof Senate. Franken didn't get sat until, I think, the summer, and Kennedy died by the following January. And so there was, a narrow bandwidth what they had. And I think, the Affordable Care Act did expand Medicaid. It was designed to expand Medicaid for, 10 to 12 million people. It's about 10, we're 14, 15 million people. It's about 10 million people now because it turned out the Supreme Court had other ideas. They definitely could have done more. And they were supposed to come in and do card check and this and that, and they did not do that.
Yeah, that went away really quickly. I remember that. That was one of the first things. They were just like, "What are you talking about? Card check? Never heard of it."
The bank bill was also incredibly disappointing. Obama had said that he would support cram down, which would have, lessened the principle of, in homes. And perhaps credit card bills. 2010 was a problem. And then, the Tea Party grew at that time, which really in many respects was just a rebranding of the Republican Party. I knew that they would go away relatively quickly. They have. Nobody talks about the Tea Party anymore. It's all just sort of like sentimental stuff.
Except for Justin Amash, who is good now, apparently.
Right. and the Republicans, came roaring back. And, I've since learned, we've had interviews where the election of Obama polarized everything in terms of racial politics and racialized a lot of things. And, there was very little holding to account to guys like John Boehner, and part of it was the Obama administration, for whatever reason, could speculate endlessly, naivete, or just like it was convenient for them way to get to their desired their desired political outcomes, did not directly take on the Republican Party, kept thinking they could go and negotiate stuff with them, and so would end up negotiating against themselves as they entered into, seeking any type of reform. And that not only failed in terms of delivering policy, it failed in terms of pointing out who was obstructing material benefits for the American public.
And the only other thing I want to add to that before I have something silly for you is just we are possibly on the verge. I say we. I'm not a Democratic Party official, and neither are you. But we are perhaps on the verge of making a very similar mistake, depending upon who gets nominated for president. Joe Biden's the biggest example that pops into my mind of being guilty of this sort of faulty thinking, but he is far from the only one who wants a dance partner and not an opponent, I think. And that's something that we've got to stop. And there's only really two candidates in the race, I think, plausibly who might do that, Sanders and Warren. But I have one more thing to tell you, Sam, and this is going to take a bit of courage for me to work up. But I need to tell you something, and I need to tell it to you in a particular voice. Because when I met you, I was going to do this for you, and I didn't have the courage looking into your face to pull it off. But this is Michael's impression of you, Sam. And I want you to know something, that I've been listening to your show for a very long time, and it is not my favorite political podcast. It is not my favorite show about politics. It is my favorite show. Do you see? You are the host of my favorite show, Sam.
Well, that is very well done, and I appreciate the sentiment. Maybe as our comedic guest on Friday, you could call in as Michael from his silent retreat.
Yeah, man. Wait, how's that going to work? You just want me to not call and did not say anything, or?
Exactly.
I'm not sure that's a great radio bit, Sam. But I'll look into it. I'll get back to you, man.
All right, man. Well, it was a pleasure doing this, and I really, I obviously I like your calls on the show, and I haven't had a chance to listen to Dissonant Peasant as much as I want to, but the episodes I have, I'm very excited about. Whenever I head back to Worcester, I remind people that Francis Perkins is from there and went to the same high school that my parents did.
Thank you so much, Sam. That really makes me happy.
Very excited.